with check-in, which is probably one of the more complicated things for new facilitators to navigate, again, we want to explore for you as a facilitator when you have led groups, what do you know about check-in? What do you know about everything from how you frame it, how you set it up, to the essential components of what you want to include, to whether you start or someone else starts? What are the things you consider, and why do we even do it? What's the purpose? So take a moment, sit down with your journal, whatever you have in front of you, and maybe make a few notes about check-in process and what you know for yourself as a facilitator.
You might even journal a little bit about what your experience has been, your personal experience being in groups, being at trainings, and doing check-in. Because I think sometimes that experience is the lens that we supervise from.
And also the biggest challenges that you had learning how to navigate this. So take a moment and make some notes now.
So check-in, I think of the essential is to really know where people are at, to really, tune into your group that afternoon, evening, day, what's moving within them, and that really frames the whole mind-body skills group. What you share in your didactic or the experiential, or even for some facilitators, later on they might have some choices of what exercises to do, and it really depends on the check-in and what people are sharing.
It's a chance for the facilitator to really know and take the pulse of the group, to know what's going on, but it's also an invitation for participants to have a moment of self-reflection, to in essence take their own pulse, because so often we don't do this. And so as supervisors, we really want to listen for that in the facilitator. We want to make sure that they are understanding the essential components of a check-in, and the fact that it isn't just storytelling, it isn't just information, it has to have that component of self-reflection. We want to make sure that the facilitator, especially if they're hearing lots of stories or whatever may be coming up, that we're guiding them in the use of language and interventions to come back to themselves and back to the group and really guide people to notice what's happening in this moment.
So in that first supervision session that you have before your facilitators start a group, it's really important to ask them about how they're going to facilitate check-in. What are the questions? What is the focus? Again, going back to why we do what we do in that first group, to really help people with their introductions are more than just who they are or what they do. It's really about who they are and what they'd like to step into, or what they'd like to explore in the group, their initial intentions for being there, and really their purpose. Rather than being very vague or non-specific, that first check-in is really setting the stage of exploring the self, exploring the emotions. So those kinds of detailed kind of questions are really important in supervision.
So it's helping the facilitator find the language and sometimes the courage to really stay with someone in a check-in, to ask them, what do you want to get out of this group? And to follow up if they say something like, learn some skills. To really teach them how to come back, and to ask them what came up when they thought about asking them. What came up for the facilitator when they thought about asking the participant that kind of follow-up question that is more focused. And it's understanding that that kind of question allows participants to have a goal in mind, a possibility of something that could be different than what's happening in their life right now. And again, that use of language and exploring the facilitator's comfort with following up and their understanding of the purpose becomes essential in supervision.
And I think I would add that part of helping facilitators really tap into how did they show up. Often new facilitators check-in kind of is an automatic thing that goes around and then they share. So where is their attention and energy? How are they connecting with each of the group? Where are their notes? Are they focused on what's coming next rather than focused on what's happening right now? So I think exploring from that place of, some of the challenges, some of the important essential elements of check-in, and asking those questions and looking for that in the process notes will really guide how you help people develop their check-in skills. So with check-in, it's also important to really frame what the focus is, to really help people notice what went well and what the challenges were, because there'll always be some challenges. One of the common challenges is timing. The check-in went really long, that it people shared so deeply. So it's helping facilitators really explore, was their sharing what was essential? Where were times to shorten that or intervene with that? Or was it really important that they felt that, but also how do they then shorten the rest of the group? They're not going to skip over the didactic or the exercise, but really to make that transition. So that would look different after a longer check-in than a shorter one.
And kind of coming back to your role as a supervisor, when you're navigating this in a supervision session with a facilitator, sometimes what can happen is a facilitator might say, we did check-in, people shared, it was good. Mm-hmm. And then they want to go on to talking about the experiential. Yeah. You really do want to come back to specific questions. So asking them, people shared, what did the sharing look like? Did everyone check in? Were there emotions that came up? Were there times when you thought about asking a follow-up question and didn't? And why? What came up? Or times when you did ask a follow-up question and what happened there? What was happening in the group as a whole if emotion was coming up with one person? So think about it as the supervisor, the sharing from the facilitator about the details of what happened, especially in something like check-in, you want to make sure that you can have an image in your mind or the movie in your mind of what it looked like and how it played out and how they met the group.
It's good to be very transparent about that, to really say to the people on the call that you're supervising that, I'm going to ask some questions because I don't have an image. I'm not really clear what that felt like. Often, it's important to use your ability to sense into what did it feel like to be in that room as that group was happening, and where do I not feel like I have that information, and to ask and inquire from that place. You may have to just pause people and just name it. Hold on, I'm going to ask you just to come back to this part because I have a few more questions, and those questions are really going to help the facilitator understand more the importance of exploring, even when things went well.
And ask them to be very specific and give them an example of what you mean. So with a check-in, if you say, I'm not quite sure what happened, they might start to give you a general overview. Often what I'll do is I'll say, go to that moment where somebody was sharing and you knew you wanted to follow up. What were they sharing? What did you say and feel in that moment? And what did they respond with? Give me your language and their language. And that way you can actually hear how they stepped in or didn't step in. Because then you can help them find a way to navigate differently than if the information is very general.
So the specifics are really important with supervision. The details and the experience. It's going back to, as we talked earlier, about those awareness on 3 levels. So it's really helping people understand and come away from supervision with more understanding of the group and their experience in the group.
And the same thing when people talk about the length of check-in. Sometimes facilitators might share that check-in went on really long and that everybody was sharing and there was so much they had to share. You want to know what they were sharing and how. Because you want to know, did somebody come in and say, I'm kind of anxious, and then they talked about a news report for 20 minutes? Or did they share something that was happening in the moment and come back to themselves in a way that brought them present to self and body and mood and connection in the moment?
And we've talked about use of self for the facilitator. You want to ask about that when you're doing supervision. How did they check in? How did they share authentically with the group that helped deepen the experience, help others in the groups really touch an emotion or a theme that everyone in the group is experiencing? That example of that, we're also mirrors and our group is a mirror for us. So there might be something that's sharing that the facilitator highlights more as a way to really be part of the process, or for people to really feel their heart, or to clarify something, or to help somebody who's grieving or feeling an emotion feel compassion. But it's always sharing from the facilitator's experience rather than giving advice or caretaking. That part of you're really trusting the group process and everyone to show up for themselves and learn skills for self-care is really important.
And again, to reiterate, the more specific you can have facilitators be in their sharing of what they said, what they felt when they said it, or where they held back, the more you'll be able to help them navigate it.
So it's probably safe to say that you're going to always have a follow-up question. You're always going to ask them for specifics, for details. Those are always, because you're going to hear live, even if they wrote it in their process note, you're going to hear live and feel that on the call.
Okay, we're going to take, and we'll decide together when we start, so we'll both look at these.
We got all those, right? Check. We didn't get that one.
Continuity.
Okay.
Okay.
So a couple other elements about check-in is each group, remember, as we facilitate, there's continuity between group sessions. So as a facilitator of the group, you want to be aware of that. So in supervision, you might ask, what are the common themes, or what is the felt experience in this group, and how is check-in helping with that? I think of the other thing you might inquire about is sometimes facilitators have to really think about, do they bring up a theme the next group, or does it feel very different? So that's a great example of helping facilitators maybe think about how they'll handle something, but the answer really depends on what they experience in the group. Does the group come back the following week, for example, and it feels like everything's moved, it's shifted, and it's better to have a very open-ended check-in rather than to bring up something that happened the last group session. So that's really encouraging and helping facilitators have the knowledge so they can make those decisions in the moment.
And it's having the knowledge of process and not just specific steps. Because that example of if something came up that was really emotional or unfinished in a previous session, if facilitators can understand that they're listening and paying attention to a process, then they can learn how to assess or introduce in a check-in, in a subsequent session, that, gee, a lot came up in the last session, if there's anything you want to share. Versus saying, I know everybody was upset, I want to be able to revisit it and talk about it, right? You want them to understand the why of what they're doing. And again, they're taking the pulse of the group. Is it still alive in the group? Is it alive for certain group members? So you're giving them a way to learn how to track and pay attention and inquire without being overly rigid. You're also asking them, in terms of the continuity of the group, to remember, and this is a challenge for new facilitators, to remember that every component in the group is part of the same group. Everything connects. There is a flow and a reason for everything. And the group as a whole fits into a series of sessions, and that has its own continuity. So you want them to just, again, hold this awareness of how the parts fit together. It will also help them know that everything doesn't have to be wrapped up in one session. That if something comes up, that there is an opportunity to come back, to revisit, to have something shift or change.
So I think that's that part of asking about transitions, asking about how does that feel as you move from a really emotional check-in, for example, into a skill where you need to give information first. How do they navigate that? Again, exploring that with specifics, and not even just, as Amy said, what they say, but how they say it. What changes in their body and their voice? How do they invite group members to transition with them? So they feel like they're not just leading, but they're joining the group process.
So as a supervisor, you're asking them, especially if they shared that there was an emotional check-in, what did you do at the end of check-in before you began didactic? And they may say, we took a break. They may say, oh, I just started teaching. Like, you want to know, what did they do and how did it feel? How did it feel for them ending the check-in? How did it feel as they started the didactic? Because, again, especially for new facilitators, they can get caught up in their list of things they have to do and not always pay attention to process. And they're right, they do have to move on to didactic and experiential. It's part of our group agreement with participants. But we want to make sure that they are recognizing that after an emotional check-in, for instance, that they're not going to have anyone's attention. So you want to know, what did you notice in the group when you tried to transition them? And what do you think you might do to help them make the transition, to become more present, to recognize that there's still something moving? And let them come up with some ideas before you do any guidance around suggesting taking a break or doing some movement, or that idea of naming. There may still be things coming up as we go to this next part, but why don't we take a break for a few minutes? So it's all of those components, but again, we keep coming back to, as a supervisor, you want to make sure that you are teaching process and not just details, awareness and not just the order of things.
Yeah, and you want to know, where are they strong? Where is it a little harder? So that helps you plan what to focus on and what to put your attentions to. Because in supervision, there's always many things you have to, and we'll talk about this in future modules, of how you decide what to focus on in that supervision session.
And remembering that in a transition, especially from something that's been emotional and check-in, there is the recognition that for the facilitator, that they're about to guide people through something that may help them with what was coming up. That's why it's so essential to have that component and not let a check-in become the entire group. And it's important to highlight, because a lot of times facilitators feel like they're doing a disservice if they stop a check-in that's emotional. And so to help them know that, but also to convey it in the group. And it may change the order of what they do. They may do a tiny didactic, experiential, and then teach about it. But again, that's tracking the energy of their group members and their focus.
And I think that part, we know when we acknowledge it, when we track it, people can feel our hearts. They can feel that. It's going to make it easier for them to transition, where if you don't do that as a facilitator, it can feel a little abrupt or insensitive. So as a supervisor, you really want to explore with the facilitator and the co-facilitator, if there's one, how that felt. You know,
So that's 4.
yeah.